Okay, so someone hands you the company tomorrow that makes the actual cardboard boxes, the plain brown ones with the Smile logo printed on the side, the boxes that show up on porches by the billions every single year. You're not competing on some flashy technology or a clever brand. You're selling a commodity, corrugated cardboard, to the single largest packaging customer on Earth, at a volume most manufacturers only dream about. Sounds like the safest, most recession-proof business imaginable, guaranteed demand from a customer that will never stop shipping things. The honest answer is that this business can generate enormous, stable revenue, and it can also lock you into one of the thinnest margin manufacturing relationships in this entire series, because you are selling an undifferentiated product to a buyer with more pricing leverage than almost any customer in modern commerce. The first thing to understand is that corrugated cardboard is about as close to a true commodity as manufacturing gets. Unlike a semiconductor or a specialized alloy, one supplier's cardboard box is, from a functional standpoint, nearly identical to another's, assuming both meet the same basic strength and dimension specifications. This means the primary variable Amazon actually cares about when selecting a box supplier isn't brand reputation or proprietary technology, it's price, reliability, and proximity to its fulfillment network. And that single fact shapes almost everything about how this business actually operates. Let's talk about what it costs to compete for this business in the first place. Building a corrugated packaging plant capable of producing at the volume and speed a customer like Amazon requires is a genuinely capital-intensive undertaking. Corrugating machinery, printing presses capable of running the branded designs, and enough warehouse and logistics capacity to store and ship enormous volumes of a bulky, low-value, per-unit product. A single modern corrugating line can cost tens of millions of dollars. And because the margin per box is measured in fractions of a cent, the entire business model depends on running that machinery at extremely high utilization around the clock, because idle capacity on equipment this expensive destroys the thin margin almost immediately. Here's where the real cost pressure lives, and it has almost nothing to do with the cardboard itself. It's in raw material volatility. The primary input, container board, made from recycled paper fiber and virgin wood pulp, is itself a globally traded commodity subject to significant price swings tied to pulp mill capacity, recycled fiber availability, and energy costs, since paper manufacturing is an energy-intensive process. A box manufacturer signing a long-term supply agreement with a customer like Amazon is essentially betting that they can absorb these raw material price swings within a contracted price, because renegotiating pricing mid-contract is difficult, and a supplier who locked in pricing before a spike in containerboard costs can find their margin compressed dramatically for the remainder of the agreement, with very little ability to pass that cost increase on to the customer, holding all the negotiating leverage in the relationship. Proximity to Amazon's fulfillment network matters enormously in this business in a way that doesn't show up in most manufacturing discussions, because shipping cost on a bulky, low-value product like empty cardboard boxes can quickly exceed the manufacturing cost itself if the plant is located too far from where the boxes are actually needed. This has pushed successful suppliers in this space toward building multiple smaller regional plants close to major fulfillment center clusters rather than a single large centralized facility, trading some manufacturing efficiency of scale for dramatically lower transportation costs, a trade-off that adds real capital expense since building several regional plants costs more upfront than one large plant, but is often the only way to keep delivered cost competitive enough to win the contract in the first place. There's also a sustainability and packaging design dimension to this business that has grown considerably more complex in recent years, adding cost and technical requirements on top of an already thin margin structure. Amazon, like most major retail and e-commerce companies, has publicly committed to reducing packaging waste and increasing recycled content in its shipping materials, which means suppliers are increasingly required to meet specific recycled fiber content thresholds, right-sized box dimensions matched to a product's actual size rather than a generic box size, and in some cases entirely new packaging formats designed to reduce the empty space and therefore the cardboard volume that a standard box would otherwise require. Meeting these evolving specifications often requires retooling production lines and investing in more sophisticated box-making equipment capable of producing custom-sized packaging on demand, a real capital expense that a supplier has to absorb in order to remain a qualified vendor, even though the underlying box itself still commands the same razor-thin commodity margin it always has. Labor and automation present a genuinely important variable in this business, because unlike the specialized technical labor markets covered elsewhere in this series, the labor challenge here is largely about running high-speed manufacturing equipment reliably and safely at the volume this customer relationship demands. Corrugating and box-making machinery runs continuously at significant speed, and maintaining that equipment, along with staffing shifts around the clock to keep utilization high enough to justify the capital investment, requires a stable, trained workforce that many regional manufacturing markets have found increasingly difficult to maintain, competing for the same pool of industrial workers against other local manufacturers and warehouse operators, some of whom can offer more attractive shift schedules or compensation. Suppliers who have invested heavily in automating portions of the box-making and printing process have generally fared better at managing this labor risk, since automation reduces the headcount needed to hit volume targets. But that automation itself represents another significant capital investment layered on top of the machinery costs already required just to enter this business. It's also worth understanding how the contract renewal cycle in this business actually shapes long-term supplier strategy, because it illustrates the anchor-tenant dynamic we've seen throughout this series in its most commoditized form yet. Because Amazon and similar large-scale buyers typically rebid their packaging supply contracts on a recurring cycle, often every few years, a supplier's business model has to account for the very real possibility of losing a significant portion of its volume at each renewal point, regardless of how well the relationship has performed up to that point. This has pushed the most durable suppliers in this space toward maintaining meaningful excess production capacity that can be redirected toward other customers if a renewal is lost, rather than building a plant sized exactly to one customer's current volume. A more conservative approach that sacrifices some efficiency in the short term in exchange for genuine survivability if the single largest customer relationship doesn't renew on favorable terms. Several regional packaging manufacturers who won long-term supply contracts with major e-commerce and retail customers have described a familiar pattern. Winning the contract meant guaranteed, predictable volume for years, the kind of stable revenue base that let the company justify investing in new production capacity with real confidence. But that same customer concentration meant that when the buyer conducted its periodic supplier renegotiation, standard practice for a company purchasing packaging at this scale, some suppliers found themselves facing price reduction demands that assumed efficiency gains the supplier hadn't actually achieved yet, forcing a choice between accepting a thinner margin to keep the volume or losing the contract to a competitor willing to accept those terms instead. Because so much of the supplier's production capacity had been built specifically to serve this one customer relationship, walking away from the contract wasn't a realistic option for many of these manufacturers, even when the renegotiated terms squeezed margins close to the break-even point. So does owning a company that supplies boxes to Amazon actually work as a business? The answer depends on a small number of variables. You need production efficiency and plant location good enough to compete on delivered cost, since price is essentially the entire basis of competition in a commodity manufacturing relationship like this one. You need enough diversification across other customers that a single renegotiation with your largest buyer doesn't determine your company's entire financial future. And you need genuine discipline about raw material cost exposure, ideally through hedging or carefully structured contract terms, because containerboard price volatility is the single biggest risk to margin in a business where the margin was already razor thin to begin with. The boxes were never really the business. The corrugating machinery, the printing presses, the branded designs, none of that is what determines whether this company survives. What determines survival is whether you can produce a commodity product at a delivered cost low enough to win a renegotiation against a customer who has no loyalty to any single supplier, and whether you've built enough of a customer base beyond that one relationship to survive the day. The answer to that question is no. That last point deserves emphasis because it's the same lesson that shows up across nearly every anchor tenant business covered in this series, just expressed here in its purest, most stripped-down commodity form. There's no brand loyalty to fall back on in this business the way a consumer-facing company might have. There's no proprietary technology creating a genuine moat the way a specialized manufacturer in a more differentiated industry could rely on. There is only delivered cost, production reliability, and how much of your revenue depends on a single buyer who reevaluates that cost every time the contract comes up for renewal. The suppliers who survive decades in this industry are rarely the ones who won the biggest single contract. They're the ones who never let any single contract, however large, become the only thing standing between the business and insolvency.